Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to this workshop on Hegel and Newton. It's so just some just how the workshop is going to go. I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, give or take, and then we're going to open up to a general discussion, and you can ask questions, you can criticize me, you can talk amongst yourselves. Whatever. We just want to get the conversation going, really. I'm very eager to know what you think about what I'm going to present. Um, and whatever your background is, I'm eager to know what you think about this stuff. Um, Very broadly, the structure of this talk is going to be I'm going to give a brief introduction about Hegel and science, and then I'm going to go into, I've decided to talk about three topics today. One is going to be sort of philosophy and science, philosophy versus science. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the different ways that philosophy and science are typically considered to interact with each other. The second theme is slightly more challenging for me, but it's going to be something along the lines of the mathematization of the world and how the putting mathematics, pure mathematics, front and center in the way that we um, conceive of the relationship of natural phenomena is a concern for Hegel. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about Hegel and Newton and their different conceptions of time, and how it may be the case that was actually quite ahead of his time with regard to how he conceived of the concept of time in contrast to Newton. Okay. Hello, Lorenzo. Welcome. Okay. So, just a bit of background. I've sort of come at this topic from my PhD, where I was studying Hegel's science of logic. And in my PhD, I was working on the transition from logic to the philosophy of nature. So, I ended up getting very interested in trying to make sense of the philosophy of nature. And a lot of the work that I do now on Hegel and science is part of that project. Um, I take it to be Hegel's ambition that his philosophy of nature has something substantive to say about the external world. And it's a very enticing project. And it's a project that I think deserves further attention. So, uh, this workshop represents some of the work that I've been sort of doing in the background on this topic. Um, the perception of Hegel as someone as a philosopher was quite negative in the beginning of the 20th century, mostly because of the rise of British empiricism. Um, and it wasn't until the 70s that Hegel's philosophy of nature was started to be regarded in a better light. And that's because philosophers started realizing that Hegel was actually very good on the science of his day. And people started looking closer at the kinds of criticisms or comments that Hegel made on sort of contemporary scientists or on people like Newton, who weren't contemporaries, but whose influence was still very much felt in the science of the day. Um, and since then, the perception of the philosophy of nature has improved. People do take it slightly more seriously. There have been some important works on it in the 2000s. And I think we're very much in the period of time where it's due for a further reconsideration. It's due for the kind of work that the science of logic generally receives with regard to people giving careful commentaries on the philosophy of nature and trying to make sense of it in the way people have with the science of logic. And obviously, here I'm thinking of Stephen Holgate and his work there, but also lots of people like John Burbage and Richard Winfield, um, all great scholars. Okay, so that's sort of a very broad introduction to the topic. Let's look at the first theme, which is sort of philosophy and science, philosophy versus science. And I say both of those topics because people tend to think of the relationship between philosophy and science as an opposition, as as if they're competing for explanations of how the world is. And of course, where Hegel really stands out from other philosophers is that he doesn't put philosophy in opposition to science. He welcomes science. He welcomes the discoveries of science, and um, as we learned recently, he was very good on the science of his day. And so Hegel is the kind of philosopher that wants to take on the results of science and put them into his philosophical system because he thinks they give us important truth statements, facts about the external world. Um, but obviously, that is not necessarily the view. And up until for most of the 20th century, the view was that philosophy and science should be sort of held apart from each other, that they had very different objectives, that they employed very different methods, and that the objects of their study were very different, right? So science deals with external phenomena, causal events, laws, universalizable laws, and it was thought philosophy deals with things that really have to do with our minds, how we think about the world, how we conceive of the world, and how also, and then you got moral philosophy, right? How we interact with each other and all that kind of stuff. So philosophy was very much sort of mind focused, we might say, and science was much more externality focused, the world. And this is sort of, let's say, one extreme of this continuum that I'm going to describe to you of how philosophy and science can be considered to interact. That philosophy and science should be held apart, that they don't have anything to say to each other, really. And any attempts for one sort of one field to creep into the other is completely misguided and fundamentally misunderstands what each field is trying to do, right? So that's one extreme. Then you've got sort of a middle path, which is, we might say, philosophy as helping scientists to clarify their concepts, right? So conceptual cleaning, conceptual maintenance, let's say. So, so this I think is kind of the dominant view nowadays. Most philosophers of science generally accept that scientists use concepts, right? There's some kind of metaphysics, even if they don't want to use the word metaphysics, they'll use something like they use concepts to make sense of things, right? Um, and those concepts obviously are not objects. They're not objects out in the world. They're um, there are, I mean, one way to put it is like there are mental operations for how we make sense of the world. And um, a scientist, again, I'm being very I'm generalizing here, but a scientist, it's not their job to think about their concepts, it's not their job to think about whether they've got the right concept or whether the way they've thought about their concept is rigorous. They do their experiments, they compare their results and they draw their conclusions. Um, and so on this view, where the philosopher can come in is the philosopher can sort of look at what the scientist is doing. They can maybe read their assumptions, look at um, maybe what they take for granted, and they can say, well, look, we can, maybe tidy up this concept, and maybe you haven't really thought through what you mean by force here, and what if you think of force in this way, and your conception of force is actually a bit circular. Why don't you think about it in this way? Um, and that's a way that philosophy can basically act as the assistant to science in many respects. Science offers philosophy material to sort of exercise its philosophical capacities, and philosophy offers its services as a conceptual dry cleaner and sort of, helps them to clarify what they think they can do. And let's call that the middle way, right? That's sort of they both have a place together. They kind of overlap, but the overlap is really um, it's important in a way to say that the emphasis is on science. Science is the one that is taking the help from philosophy, um, but philosophy is not getting involved in in the kinds of truth statements that science makes. That's up to the scientists. They're doing the experiments, they're drawing the conclusions. Okay, and then so that's the middle way. Now let's go to the other extreme, and this is where I think Hegel's philosophy of nature sort of sits, and that's philosophy can actually contribute to truth statements, facts about the world. Okay, so philosophy doesn't just tell us how our concepts work. It doesn't just tell us about how we think about the world, or it doesn't just help us tidy up our use of concepts when we're writing when we're writing up our paper on whatever experiment you did. But philosophy actually has the capacity, if done properly, right, according to Hegel, to give us something, to tell us something truthful about the external world. So, and that's quite substantive. And I think it's safe to say that's generally not held nowadays by most philosophers. Most philosophers would be very cautious about holding this view because it smacks of the kind of idealism that we sort of believe to have left behind thanks to the rise of science. And we don't want to sort of go back down that path of using pure reason to deduce objects, right? It's that kind of stuff. Now, of course, I don't think that's what Hegel is doing, right? I don't think Hegel is that kind of pre-Kantian rationalist philosopher. I think Hegel is much more nuanced. That if I had to put it in a single phrase, I'd say he's a kind of idealist materialist or a dialectical materialist, to try and steal back the phrase from Marx. I think Hegel is a dialectical materialist, not Marx. Well, maybe Marx, but Hegel definitely is. Insofar as he sees, being and thought as speculatively united. But I don't want to go down that path now. That's all I'm sort of going to say on this first topic that I'm going to address. There are these sort of three ways that philosophy and science, broadly construed, obviously there are lots of areas in between, but there are these three broad ways that philosophy and science can interact. And Hegel's philosophy of nature sort of sits on the far right extreme of this. Well, not far right, but on the other extreme side of this. There's nothing far right about Hegel's philosophy of nature, I think. Okay, all right. Okay, theme 2, quantity versus quality. All right, so Newton is often credited with inaugurating what people call the mathematization of nature. Even though people before Newton, like Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei, used mathematics and to try and find relationships between the measurements that they would take of phenomena, and they would put them in, and they would put all that into a formula to try and distill sort of the truth of what they'd observed. Even though there were people before Newton, Newton is credited really, and it must be because of the application of pure mathematics that Newton inaugurated in the Principia, with sort of putting mathematics front and center with how we try to understand the natural world. If you can express a physical relationship in mathematics, your expression of it is closer to the truth than without mathematics. That's sort of the Newtonian heritage, if you want to sort of put it in a sort of a sound-bitey way. And that was the case when Newton was alive and when Newton had published his work. And that is still the case when Hegel is reading his physics textbooks on Newton. Newton is still sort of thought of as this figure. All that to say, this is why I think it's sort of it's a Newtonian, it's a gripe with Newtonianism that Hegel has when he complains about the overuse of quantity when we're talking about nature. So let's just go into a bit more detail here. So what do we mean exactly by this? If you read the philosophy of nature, you'll see that Hegel will place great value in explaining the explaining the conceptual structure of the concepts that he looks at in nature through their qualitative determinations or their qualitative characteristics. Okay, so what do we mean? Well, take it like a frog, for example. A frog has a bunch of qualities. It's got shape, it's got color, it's got texture. Okay. And Hegel will say something like, well, look, this is what science does. Science will take these qualities and it will assign some kind of numerical value to them. All right. And then based on that numerical value, it's going to sort of plug it into a mathematical function of some sort. It's going to take out a conclusion. And then from that quantitative conclusion, it's going to draw qualitative, it's going to make qualitative conclusions about the world. And Hegel's concern fundamentally with this is that the assignation of pure quantities to qualitative things, so objects in the world, is an abstraction. The quantities are not inherent to the object in the way that its qualities are. And Hegel has, throughout his philosophy, really, a general concern with abstraction, because we tend to think of abstraction as a way to get closer to the truth. We think that by abstracting things from an object, we're sort of pulling away all the irrelevant aspects of an object and getting to the core of an object. And therefore, what we arrive at is truer. And Hegel's concern when we're dealing with concrete externality, so the natural world, is that we're sort of missing the object. We're not actually treating the object, we're treating an abstraction of it. And that's really his main concern with the use of pure quantities when science talks about phenomena. It's an abstraction, and because it's an abstraction, it doesn't give us the kind of absolute certainty that we expect it to, because it's mathematics. Obviously, Hegel is not critical of the use of quantity in a way of understanding natural objects. There are lots of quantities that are part of an object, right? So an object has mass, an object might have motion. Hegel is not saying that these things are not relevant. What his concern is the application of pure mathematics. And I think a good illustration of where this has led to a certain extent is contemporary theoretical physics, which is almost exclusively based on pure mathematics. Sure, yeah, the physicists have the data from observations and experiments, but then they create all these theories based on pure math. So think of string theory, for example. Hegel would be very concerned about this kind of application guiding scientific thought, because Hegel would think, well, look, this has nothing to do with external reality. This is a complete abstraction from external reality. And I think what Hegel would say actually is the reason why it isn't. What Hegel would also say is that there is an assumption here that you see mathematics as somehow being the path to reveal the inner nature of reality, or if not that, there is something about mathematics that really lines up with how reality is. And if you can describe reality in mathematics, then you're going to get to the truth of reality. And just and Hegel would have metaphysical concerns about that because fundamentally it is a metaphysical assumption. And yeah, so I think contemporary theoretical physics is a nice example of how pure math can sort of be substantially detached from the physical world, and yet make qualitative claims about how the physical world might be, right? Okay. So that's quality versus quantity. And now I want to go on to Hegel and Newton on time. And the reason why I wanted to really touch on this topic is because up until now, the last two bits that we've been talking, uh, just 10 more minutes, Philip. We've been talking about having quite abstract. And that's entirely because to sort of concretely talk about these things will take a lot of time and it's quite difficult. But I think comparing Hegel and Newton's concept of time is a very nice, simple illustration of how philosophy might be able to say something truthful about the external world, um, and how it could help science in that regard. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at Newton's conception of time. Okay, so in the Principia, in the Scholium to the definitions, Newton talks about absolute time. Okay, I'm just going to quote very briefly from this small paragraph. So he writes, absolute, true, and mathematical time in and of itself and of its own nature, without reference to anything external, flows uniformly and by another name is called duration. Okay, so what we get from this and from another paragraph elsewhere, but I'm not going to read that now, is that Newton thinks that there is such a thing as absolute time. Okay, there is this constant flow of time, and importantly, it is without reference to anything external. So it's independent. It's not dependent on anything. It is wholly itself. Obviously, Newton thinks there is such a thing as relative time. We all perceive time differently. We all have different ways of measuring time. But these are all subjective things. These are all notions of time within our minds. Newton thinks out there in the objective world, there is this absolute time and it's constantly flowing. And I guess in theory, if you had some kind of clock, a special clock, you could sort of measure the universal time and it wouldn't be bound up by your subjectivity. Okay. Now, Hegel, on the other hand, in the philosophy of nature, talks about time very differently. So time is the second category in nature, and I'm going to quote from the addition to paragraph 257, just because it gets the point across very quickly. I would normally never quote from an edition in the philosophy of nature. Don't think poorly of me. It's just Hegel, when he's quoted from his lectures, he says things in a much more poetic way that sort of gets the point across really quickly. Okay, so Hegel writes, so first we had space, and then there's a conceptual development, and then space develops into time. Okay, so that's what's just happened. We just started. The truth of space is time, and thus space becomes time. The transition to time is not made subjectively by us, but made by space itself. And then there's this excellent line, which I really hope Hegel really said. In pictorial thought, space and time are taken to be quite separate. We have space and also time. Philosophy fights against this also. Really fantastic quote. Okay, so here we can see the core distinction between Hegel and Newton. All right, for Newton, there is space and also time. For Hegel, space is time. Space and time are bound up. They're not just conceptually interrelated, they are ontologically interrelated, right? Because Hegel is making real claims. Well, he's making claims about the world, about reality as it is, right? That's what he wants to at least claim. That's his ambition. Um, so, for those of you who are already ahead of me, I think I'm not the only person that thinks this. This is a remarkable foreshadowing of Einstein's theory of special relativity. Now, Hegel doesn't foreshadow the mathematics of special relativity. That takes an Einstein to do. But what Hegel does with his philosophy is by thinking through the concept of space, he's able to conceptually unpack the fact that time is related to space. It's not something that's independent of space. And so without all those complicated experiments and without the impressive mathematics, Hegel is able to come up with a conception of space-time, of four-dimensional space-time, in a way that Einstein would 100 or so years later. And again, this is not the same thing, obviously, as special relativity. You can't read Hegel's conception of time and then just derive special relativity from it. It is philosophy, and so there is a distinction of domains, but there is an overlap as well, right? The same way space and time both are what they are, but also they overlap. They're conceptually interrelated. And so, yes, just to wrap up, I think this is a very intriguing example of how conceptual thought, in particular in sort of Hegel's version of it, gave an understanding of time that was ahead of its time. The pun was not intended, sorry. Okay, thank you. That's all for me. Thanks for your attention. So I think we're going to open up to a just general discussion. Philip will moderate. So Philip, if you could please just unmute people as and when you please.
Okay, so we will try to keep this a little bit neat and tidy. So raise your hand, the react hand thing if you have a question, and then I'll try to keep track of the order. So Ralph, you go up ahead.
Yes, thank you. I want to briefly sort of qualify various assertions made about Newton and by application Galileo. And secondly, about contemporary physics, and thirdly, about perhaps a different way of utilizing what Hegel says about space and time. So firstly, one of the things that's most important about Newton, I think, is the self-limiting nature of what he's doing in science. He doesn't try to create a comprehensive philosophy as others did, like Descartes, Leibniz, etc. And he limits himself to physics and its implications for astronomy. I don't know what he was doing when he was fooling around with alchemy and so forth, but he doesn't really make the same general claims for mechanical materialism as you would see that some of the French would make later, like La Métrie. He limits himself. And so the mathematisation of nature is somewhat limited in its application. So that's one thing that's important.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing about the role of mathematics and Newton and also in Galileo is that mathematics is central, but it's not the type of positivism that we got used to later. They're both interested in a qualitative understanding of nature. And one of the things that Newton completed that Galileo started was to destroy Aristotle's, what Philip Frank calls Aristotle's animistic view of the universe, where everything seats its natural place. Galileo and Newton, especially Newton, essentially equalized the realms of nature. The heavens have no special qualities, no special metaphysical properties. And this was revolutionary in destroying sort of the primitive ancestors of the modern thinking. and that is actually rather important. Secondly, the reason mathematics is important is because both recognized that the ultimate causal structure of reality may still be up for grabs. We may not completely understand it. We're going to work towards it. But in the meantime, mathematics can give us some exact information upon which to base ourselves, as opposed to tradition. So I would say that in a sense, Newton is not quite as guilty of these things as will happen later. Now, I want to say very briefly again that the role of mathematics in this transitional period of the scientific revolution, which is very messy, as we know if we know about Newton and these other people. They weren't completely modern people, but they were stepping into it. And there's literature on the subject, a lot of which was done by relevant literature that was done by non-Marxists, but deal with the complexity of this transition in that time period. And we can always get into that some other time. So I think that's important to really understand, because there's certain groups, and the Frankfurt School, of course, was very guilty of this, of very simplifying this, what this means in terms of quantification and positivism and so forth. The second point I want to have is an interesting point you made about contemporary physics, because what I think happens, and especially true when it comes to popularization and when people try to promote their ideas, is that there's a combination of positivism and bad metaphysics. It's never a pure positivism. It's always using the mathematics to make some really bad claims in public that they couldn't get away with in the scientific literature. And I can give some examples of this. I think one of the terrible things that is done is the abuse of relativity. The concept of the black universe. Einstein had nothing to do with this. And in fact, not only that, but he didn't even really emphasize the concept of time as the fourth dimension, at least not at first. As you probably know, that was Minkowski in 1909. And it has to do with treating time as a spatial dimension, because you can write a graph, X, Y, Z, and then T. And so you can treat it that way as a mathematical object. But Einstein did not do that, at least at first. And I think that the concept of the black universe is an example of this metaphysical distortion that comes from taking a mathematical construct and creating a wrong physical interpretation of it. And finally, Hegel's business about space and time, I think that's interesting because it deals with a more fundamental issue of the relationship between mathematics and be able to create a static picture, a correct but static picture of the world in flux. But essentially, that relationship between the structure and the world in flux has been something that has been dealt with and mystified and turned into mysticism in all civilizations in which it's been dealt with, whether it's ancient Greece, whether it's in India or China. This idea that that the world in flux is somehow elusive in relationship to the construct that we make of it. But nonetheless, there is an objective relationship between the two that where you do not have to resort to mysticism in terms of dealing with it. And I think that perhaps Hegel was onto this in some kind of way. I don't know if he formulated it correctly. I think Marx, in his dealing with the calculus, was also dealing with this also, even though he did not follow the latest developments in the formalization of calculus in the 19th century. It's this really idea between the nature of creating what has to be a static conception on paper of a graph, for example, versus the world, which is actually in flux. And I think perhaps maybe that's what Hegel was addressing, but that's what we also have to think about when we deal with nonsense like the black universe or the multiverse or other types of popular mystifications of what is essentially empirical data combined with mathematics. So that is sort of the essence of what I have to say. And I think if we pursue those areas, we could come up with a much more sophisticated view than what we often see that's done by Marxists or others, popularizers in this world in which, very abstruse things are turned into mystifications in the means of popularization.
Yeah.
So that's it for now.
Thank you, Ralph. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. That was very thoughtful. I just want to say three things. One is the first thing you said so everything you said about Newton, I think I agree with what you say. And we do have to be more careful in our distinctions, I think, between Newton and Newtonianism. So as you said, what Newton wrote and what traditions grew out of it afterwards. I think you're right. I'm not entirely sure that Newton wasn't committed to some kind of atomism in the Principia. The way he talks about bodies um, does seem to me to be broadly atomistic, um, but there's possibly room for debate there. Um, with regard to contemporary theoretical physics, I get a lot of my ideas about this from a physicist called Sabine Hossenfelder. Are you familiar with her?
A little bit. I've seen her a little bit. Kind of weird, but I'm not sure what to do with her.
She's got this excellent book. It's called Lost in Math: How Beauty Took Physics Astray, or something like that. And it's actually a very philosophical book for an experimental physicist. And basically, she just talks about how she's got this very sort of meta point about how funding in physics is very much dominated by people who, by big theories devised by, what's the right way to say it, is the way funding is allocated is somewhat dominated by theories that are more or less purely mathematical. Um, and she thinks that it would be better organized if funding was sort of uh, put towards more experimentation. Basically, a bit more experimenting, a bit less theoretical physics would be better for physics. And the whole Lost in Math, How Beauty Led Physics Astray is basically a criticism of how people prioritize mathematics as a like the more, there's this sort of aesthetic assumption about the world that reality is simple, reality is elegant, and that a mathematical explanation of reality that is simple and elegant is the more accurate explanation of reality. And I think you're right in a sense to say that we are somewhat misguided. The majority of the physics community probably doesn't believe this that much. We're probably talking about a few very well-regarded physicists like the Brian Greens of the world. Um, but I think it is quite a prevailing view, at least amongst the common population. Um, but yeah, I would recommend her book, Ralph. It's quite
Yeah,
good.
I'll look at it. About the funding thing.
Yeah,
Do we know who actually makes these decisions? Is it physicists? Is it somebody in the Defense Department or the War
it's
Department?
I think it's non-physicists. It's the classic case of people that aren't related to the field making decisions about how much money the field should get.
Well, what's interesting. I'm way out of date, but back in 1980, I think I was having too much fun in the late 70s to recognize how liberalism was destroyed in real time, which happened in the late 70s in the United States. And I missed how quickly it happened. And when I came back to hang around universities, I found that there was a sea change and an increased sense of irrationalism. And I attended this one lecture by a physicist, and it was basically a very thinly veiled um, proposition that you should just go where the money is.
Mm,
Your theoretical questions basically are geared towards where the money goes. He didn't quite say exactly that, but that's really what it amounted to. And of course, the money comes from the military industrial complex, basically, or for it.
mm,
And so I don't think that this particular physicist was guided by, abstract aesthetics. I think he was thinking of, whatever research seems to be uh, uh, um, uh, practical, or well, he didn't use the word practical, but that seems to be what's scientifically viable.
yeah,
And so what you're saying, that's why I asked who funds it, because I'm just
yeah, yeah.
wondering how the propaganda gets translated into the people who are actually providing the money, given that this guy was making basically a pitch for going where the money is. And I had something to say in public about that, which people didn't like. But anyway, go ahead.
No, no, that's very interesting. I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's definitely significant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ralph.
All right, Bruce, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you was talking about Hegel's space, but I thought about something Ralph said, and the craziest thing I ever heard that somebody in science said was Donald Hoffman on a podcast. He talked about headsets, reality. He said when you turn around, the world behind you disappears. And
Okay.
I had to look at it twice. That sounds so crazy to me. Anyway, I like Sabina too. She a big podcaster. But I was thinking about Hegel's idea of space and what Kant did with it and what Hegel did with it. He took space and time and put it together and said that time is space. So if you say that time is space, then you would have to bring in the logos, wouldn't you? If you said time is space, that's something that you would have to see. That's something that you would see, and how you was talk about duration and have to have a boundary.
Um,
You can't just say you have to be able to speak the words and see it. So it's a metaphysical idea.
yeah.
And matter of fact, if you talked about Newton and duration, and that's almost the same thing. You can't have duration without a perspective, because you have to know what a bounded it. Have to have some kind of boundary, and you can't set time and space. And it is because you can look off at a distance
Mm-hmm.
and see how far you have to go
Mm-hmm.
to get there. But Heidegger would say you already there. That's how we move through space, is that through the Dasein, through the Da, through the there, that when you think of something, you actually already there. That's how come you can endure and go through this duration in space.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, Hegel is like in the science of logic,
Mhm.
um, what Hegel is saying about space and time, he's working through the concepts of space and time, right? The same way when he worked through the concepts of being and nothing, right? Um, and but obviously, if you read Hegel as doing an ontology, right, as doing a study of being, then he's not just talking about space and time as our concepts, but he's talking about space and time as they actually are. So uh, interestingly, Hegel does say that space and time are infinite, right? So there maybe, and there is this notion of sort of the already there-ness of space and time, which sounds very similar to what you were saying about Heidegger.
Mhm.
Um, but I think you should definitely have a look at that section. I think you'd find some interesting material there, some
Yeah,
points of
yeah.
similarity with what you were saying.
You say they infinite, but when you say they infinite, it doesn't touch us. You have to bring it into a measure, wouldn't you? It would have to be something they're infinite, but then when you maybe what was the right word for it, because I hadn't read enough of it, idealize, you would have to you can't separate it. It have to be some kind of, when it's really something that you're dealing with, is something that's bounded,
Well,
you
that
know.
wouldn't be the true infinite for Hegel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that I guess that would be a point of contrast. Thank you, Bruce.
All right, Suresh, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So I have just two brief, I think, clarificatory questions. One is about the Marx and dialectical materialism thing. So, yeah, I mean, if you say that I mean, if you mean it seriously, that Hegel is a dialectical materialist, and in a way, one could say that yeah, he is. He accepts the. I mean, he's not a subjective idealist like many others. He accepts the reality of space, time, and nature as such, as being there, but and in a way also being in a syllogism of the system, and one syllogism also being prior to logic and spirit. So that could be there, but if you say that, but when you said that he is a dialectical materialist or more than Marx, perhaps, then um, I'm wondering what would be the difference between Hegel and Marx on their conception and how they conceive the relationship between nature, spirit, and logic. Or would you say that no, there is not actually? I mean, Marx and Hegel are basically the same. So, but then what happens to the whole, the whole metaphor of turning Hegel on? Is that so? Yeah, I mean, that's one. And
Okay.
so, and second is about what you said about quality and quantity. So you said when, as in the method of the empirical sciences, and especially in recent times, how quantitative this obsession with quantitative quantification of nature, uh, it makes you lose something of the reality. But I was just wondering that in the logic, um, of course, you start with quality and then you have quantity, and it is quality that turns out to be quantity. And from the other side as well, at the end of the quantity section, we again get back into quality. So, no matter how limited or inadequate that quantification of nature in study might be, wouldn't that lead to some insight at least? And I remember that Hegel also somewhere says that why this would be more so in the case of the nature, unlike a spirit, uh, because there these quantitative determinations, as it were, prevail more than in spirit, where organic relations and all of those other things predominate, where you cannot really have these, you cannot get far with merely quantity. But in nature, you would, because the realm of nature is the realm of externality, and yeah, and that is associated with quantity. So all of that, and somehow that seems to be true as well. I mean, in physics, as we see with numbers, you can do a lot of things. Unlike, you cannot do a lot of things in psychology, philosophy, politics, sociology, ethics, in all of so. So I just didn't see as it were, the other dialectical side of this quantification of nature or quantitative study of nature. And I had a third question related to the Newton section, but I have forgotten that. So yeah,
Okay, maybe you'll remember it whilst I'm answering.
yeah, okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, very, very nice questions. On the Hegel and Marx thing, I don't know anything about Marx. All I know is that people say that he is a dialectical materialist and Hegel is sort of like this absolute idealist. So all I know is this caricature distinction between them. All I know, all I would say to what I said, that Hegel is sort of the dialectical materialist, is we should, and I think there is a shift away from this view. We should stop thinking of Hegel as an idealist philosopher, as someone thinks that either everything is just concepts or there is this Kantian distinction between our minds and the external world. And all we can know is, what we can know because of our subjective minds. We should start thinking of Hegel as someone who has this understanding of reality as being speculative, the speculative identity of thought and being. So in that respect, when I read the philosophy of nature, one of the reasons why I'm so intrigued by it and why I think it deserves closer attention is because it is a genuine work of um, ontological philosophy of nature. Someone who thinks that by fusing philosophy and science together, you can clarify and discover the conceptual relationships of the external world. And that to me is dialectically materialist. You are saying something about the material world and you are comprehending it as dialectical, as speculative. You're not creating this distinction. So I'm sorry I can't say more about Marx. That's just my fault.
That helps, yeah.
I do want to actually read Marx because of the relationship between him and Hegel, and I guess it must be very interesting philosophically to see why Marx thinks he's different from Hegel and whether he's right or wrong about that. But based on my very superficial understanding of why Marx is a dialectical materialist and my understanding of Hegel, I think that's not really justified. I think that's just based on a misconception of Hegel as this sort of absolute idealist that just wants everything to be mined. The stuff you were saying about quality and quantity, I think that is all on the right track. It requires further research. That's sort of the shitty answer I'm going to give you. I'm sorry. But I think it's exactly the right kind of questions to be asking with regard to what Hegel wrote. There is an excellent book by John Burbage called Real Process: How Logic and Chemistry Combine in the Philosophy of Nature. Do you know that book?
No, I'm not.
I would highly recommend it. I think you can find it online for free. It's quite old. Anyway, in that book, John Burbage, who is an excellent Hegel scholar, he takes the chemism section from the Science of Logic. He takes the sections in the Philosophy of Nature where Hegel talks about chemistry. And he also looks at the logic of measure from the Science of Logic, right,
Yeah.
which comes after quantity. And he sort of shows how all these things come together in Hegel's analysis of chemistry in the Philosophy of Nature. And he tries to, make sense of this whole picture. And one of Burbage's points is that the logic of measure, which is sort of the unity of quality and quantity, is sort of the place where you find Hegel's positive account of how a quantitative understanding of nature is constructive, because it sort of fuses quality and quantity. It doesn't just take quality as an abstract quantity, it's qualitatively quantitative, right? That's measure for Hegel. And that's where Hegel, well, Burbage at least claims, where you find Hegel's more positive account of how a quantitative approach to understanding the natural world can be had. So I think you're on the right tracks there, and it deserves further study. This is an area of Hegel that is extremely understudied. Especially the logic of measure. I don't think anyone's dusted that old chapter off in centuries.
Thank you.
But yeah, thank you very much, Suresh. Thank you.
All right, no more pending questions, but I'll sneak one in. And if anyone else has some, just raise your hand. So, Ahilleas, thank you for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed that. And I think it was during the second or first phase, maybe, you had this two extremes and then the middle way, and then Hegel's on the one extreme and on the which he sort of had philosophical assertions that were substantive about nature. That's Hegel's extreme. And then the other extreme was scientists doing making factual claims, but then using the accepted methodologies. So like with math, right?
Not necessarily with math, but just science and philosophy are two distinct domains that shouldn't overlap. They don't have anything to say to each other, basically.
Okay, right.
So philosophy should just butt out of science.
I see. Okay, so
Yeah.
maybe this mapping doesn't work with the question I have. But it speaks to something else you were saying, which was we shouldn't be thinking of Hegel in terms of like a pure old school idealist. But I'm wondering now with what we said about Sabine Hossenfelder and the aestheticization of science and so on. Do you see that as a way of going back to idealism?
I think it's got strong idealist roots, right? Because um, it's based on this sort of intuitionist view of mathematics, which is that mathematics was sort of there's something mystical about mathematics. It's something that we can just do, right? It's not out there in the world. The numbers aren't out there in the world. It's something that we can just do, and it somehow chimes with nature.
Hmm.
It sort of has this very nice way of mapping onto nature or describing nature in a very good way. And, that's, I think it's fair to say that's a very intuitionist view of how mathematics works or why it works. And that is quite idealist. Um, right? That sounds very Wolffian, pre-Kantian sort of metaphysics. That, we can just intuit um, being. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, in a way, it's also uncritical, but that should be also vulnerable to kind of dialectical immanent critique. Do you see that going on in Sabine's criticism of it, or does she just take this sort of social critique route?
Um, no, I think she's got does she take that? She doesn't take that kind of critique. She's got this very sort of general critique that, you've got these metaphysical assumptions which are quite powerful, and they're doing a lot of the justificatory work for why your work matters, right? So, you know, what you came up with is valuable because it's elegant or it's simple or it's beautiful, right? Um, that those aesthetic categories are doing a lot of the justifications for why your work is significant, for why the mathematic conclusions you've derived are significant. And as a physicist, right, she like when you listen to her speak, she's German as well, right? So she's just like she's just like a materialist. It's just like no nonsense experiments, which I respect. Fair enough, She's an experimental physicist. She knows what her field demands of her. And she sort of sees these theoretical physicists stepping outside the bounds of what science can reasonably do. Those are the kinds of that's really her criticism. Like, look, you've got this huge metaphysical assumption about mathematics and beauty and the world. Um, that's not justified in science. We should stop guiding our research because of this, and we should guide it by experimental results instead, which is what science should be doing.
Yeah.
That sort of. I read the book a long time ago, but I think that's basically the premise.
Yeah. Yeah, it circles back to something Ralph was saying that it's good math, but bad metaphysics, which
Something
quite
like that, yeah. Yeah,
nicely put. All
yeah.
right, thank you very much, Ahilleas.
No,
So
thank you
Ralph
for that.
has his hand up, so I'll give the word to you.
Was it me or the next person?
No, it's
I,
you,
I
Ralph.
I just wanted to put another piece of information here that's interesting because I don't know that much, but there was I heard a very interesting lecture by a person who's a very orthodox Hegelian, which is very irritating, but nonetheless, he gave this really interesting lecture on Hegel's criticism of I think it's Bode's law, which was arguing on purely numerical progression that there had to be some planet between Mars and Jupiter. Maybe that was it. Anyway, I think it might be accessible on this website, Institute for Advanced Dialectical Research, which I don't think is very advanced, but you might be able to find that lecture there. And but what was interesting about the lecture is that I think that the lecturer was not capable of drawing any really interesting conclusions from it. But what he showed, but I think what was important about what Hegel has to say is that just finding or proving some type of numerical progression doesn't tell you anything because there's no causal basis behind it. It's just basically numerical magic, numerology or whatever. And I think that that's true because what you would need to go with that is not just finding some pattern, but some physical law or explanation which explains why things would have to be the way that they would be, which presumably we now have, at least in terms of the applicability of of Newtonian physics, or for that matter, relativistic physics. We could explain why certain things are the way that they are, but just engaging in some kind of number magic, finding progressions, doesn't give you a real scientific explanation. And so I think that is quite interesting, and it could show that Hegel did have some kind of insight into what's involved, other than just playing with numbers, which of course we can come up with all kinds of things, finding relationships without any explanation for them. The problem with this lecturer is that he was so interested in vindicating Hegel, he actually didn't have anything to say about what might be the actual implications of what Hegel's argument actually is from our point of view now, because I thought this was very interesting. But I think the point is not to say, oh, well, Hegel's vindicated, but rather, well, he was onto something there. What can we learn from this?
Yeah.
And that is, we need physical explanations, to go with our mathematics, which in fact Galileo and Newton were interested in. Newton himself was not even satisfied with his own explanation, universal gravitation. He thought it was nonsense, but that was all he could come up with. There's got to be some explanation for this, even though it may not be satisfactory. It's not just the numbers. There's something physical behind it. And that's something that does either get lost today or gets translated into some bad science fiction.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph. All right, Barish, you have your hand up. Go on ahead.
I don't have a question really. I'm gonna sign up for the course, obviously, but the thing that I guess we will discover is, I'm sort of I have this tendency to have this mathematization myself too. I grew up as an engineer. Science and math was my thing, and an explanation of the world in mathematical terms was the proper thing to handle. Later in life, I discovered philosophy. It's as if like maybe I'll try to find out what this, good math, bad metaphysics, trying to kind of fix the bad metaphysics part. Here is might be the what I would like to discover myself. Um, However, maybe I mean the thing that I'm sensing is I read an article a long time ago, Carlo Rovelli, an Italian physicist who works in quantum gravity. He was reading Heidegger, and it's as if like even quantum, mechanics is missing this part. What is the explanation of this? How does this make sense to us? Like the world we experience and the world, uh, with the particle world is totally different than us. How does that kind of map to how we know it? Um, it's as if like even there, math, physics requires some sort of a relation to philosophy, a relation that's broken long time ago. I mean, physics was not a separate department. It wasn't a separate realm before. I mean, I guess maybe around the time of Newton it became this thing. Well, there's this explanation. Before that, there was no such thing as physics. I think it was called natural philosophy, something like that. You know. Anyway, I'm just mumbling, but I guess I'm just trying to sort of uh, ground myself to a proper metaphysics of this. How does this world work, and how does it work in a way that there's this mathematical explanation of things, one way of abstraction, and there's this abstraction in the philosophical realm. How does these two realms sort of jive together? Is what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, as I said.
Thank you, Barish. No, I think there is a question there. So Hegel, maybe something someone might mistakenly take away from this workshop is that Hegel is critical of mathematics, and he's not. Hegel thinks mathematics is great, right? He spends a lot of time in the quantity chapter and in other parts of his works talking at length about mathematics. In fact, in the collection of the talks given at that conference. So there was a conference in 1987 called Hegel and Newtonianism. The proceedings were published in 1993, and there's a whole bit of the conference that was dedicated to Hegel and mathematics. And there are 5 or 6 very nice papers on Hegel and mathematics there, if you're interested in sort of looking at that. But Hegel was definitely not critical of mathematics. Mathematics does give truthful, does give us knowledge about things. Okay. Hegel's concern is foundationally, his concern is mathematics is taken to provide absolute certainty. That's his first concern, right? And I'm better on geometry than other aspects of mathematics. But in his criticism of Euclid, for example, Hegel's concern is, well, look, you start off with all these definitions, all these axioms, right? And classic Hegel here, you might just you get annoyed every time you hear it. But Hegel's point is, these are all assumptions. All of your axioms are assumptions. Yes, it seems obvious that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It seems intuitively obvious, fine, but it's an assumption. It's not justified. And everything that you're building afterwards is all based on mathematical justification. And that's why it's significant. But your assumptions are not. Your assumptions are just assumptions. That's sort of Hegel's foundational concern with the way mathematics is used, I guess, particularly in the science of his time. It's that it comes with this aura of absolute certainty. And always with Hegel, for him, the picture is more nuanced. It's very helpful. Yes, it gives us knowledge about things. No, it's not the be all and end all of how we can find out about the truth of things. So yeah, Hegel doesn't talk much about engineering, I think, Barish. I'm sorry. But I imagine he would say, if mathematics works in engineering, great, no problem. Philosophy probably doesn't have much to say about how a bridge should be built. And that's fine. It doesn't need to.
I
Hegel.
was listening.
Mm.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, you go ahead.
I thought you were finished.
Yeah.
I listened to the conversations you had with Philip on sPhil, and I was thinking this assumption part of it. Like I was just like, what does Hegel exactly expect Newton to do here? Like does he expect Newton to start from being and nothing and then write, but that's the joke, okay? Like this is one of the things that I wanna what is the bad metaphysics part that Hegel is concerned with here? Plus, again, as I said, like I wanna sort of kind of correct what my or not correct, but maybe make adjustments to what my worldview is that requires some attention here. I guess it's all about in philosophy, what is your assumption exactly? Like, do you kind of analyze everything? Did you ask all the necessary questions to yourself regarding certain topic? Anyway, that was my kind of point of view when I was mumbling. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
No, of course. And just one last thing. In a way, I hate myself every time I say that Hegel's criticism is that you're assuming things because it's kind of annoying after a while to keep saying this. And you're right. What does Hegel expect? Thank you, Lorenzo. Take care. What does Hegel expect? That Newton first does the science of logic before he writes the Principia? That's ridiculous. And I think it's important to not constantly frame these conversations as arguments and oppositions. I think Hegel understands that science has its own way of doing things. It's got its own methodology. It has its own domain of objects. And it's got to do that in order to be science. It's not fair to ask a scientist, first you got to do the science of logic before you can do an experiment. It's counterproductive as well. the way I think we should, when we're doing these kind of comparative works, I think we should always be charitable, you know? We should see how we can improve the overall understanding of a concept. We should see what can be gained by putting two thinkers in conversation. Because there's a lot of stuff that Hegel is indebted to Newton for. And Hegel is very open about that. So I think, yeah, I think we should the way we frame it is important. It should be framed as much more collaborative than oppositional. Thank you, Barish.
All right. Bruce, you have a hand up again? I think this will be our last question for this evening, and then we'll dash.
Yeah. Sean Carroll gave some. Have you ever saw Sean Carroll talks in 2022? Did you see it?
I've seen a lot of Sean Carroll. I don't know what specifically you're referring to.
He had something in 2022. He had something called the biggest ideas in the universe.
Yeah.
You saw it?
Yeah.
Okay, so he started off talking about the conservation of momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that the modern idea of the conservation started with even Cena, and then Galileo improved it, and then what Newton did, he mathematized it.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly, I might have missed something you said. Exactly what did Hegel say directly about the conservation of momentum?
Bruce, I'm not sure, to be honest. I haven't studied those sections carefully.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
That's what the talk was about, the rest and conservation of momentum. So.
Very nice. Yeah. I think Sean Carroll's podcast series, The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, is really good. I really enjoyed it. He did it during lockdown, so obviously he had a lot of time on his hands.
He did during lockdown. Yeah.
But I
and
think
Brian Greene did something like that too.
Yeah.
They both. Yeah.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you, Bruce. And thank you to everyone for your attention and for your questions. Really appreciate it. I'm glad it was interesting.
I think we may have mixed up a few things with the upcoming mechanism course, because that concerns rests, doesn't it, Ahilleas?
Yes. Oh, is that what you were referring to, Bruce?
Yeah.
Well, conservation of momentum does have to do with
it does, right?
Inertia. It's inertia, so that would be rest, wouldn't it?
I see. Okay.
Inertia, conservation of momentum, that's the same thing. Almost.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Did you watch?
I guess it would be rest if you said it's time and space. That's
I did a video on Hegel's concept of rest. Have you had a chance to watch that yet?
Watched it. I watched it. Yeah, I watched it.
Right.
Yeah. Right. But I thought when you was talking about rest, I assumed you was talking about conservation momentum, and
I guess not. I mean, not entirely.
It's not the same.
I don't think it's not exactly the same. No.
Okay.
I don't think it's exactly.
I thought because it's talking about an inertial system, right?
Yeah.
Inertial. That's rest, and no matter where you look, what's called relativity, talking about rest in this, and the laws of physics is the same. If you're in an inertial system, the laws of physics the same. It's just like you at rest when you're going at a not acceleration, but at a velocity.
Yeah.
And if it's constant, you're in an inertial system.
I mean, the way you're framing it sounds like it's the same. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't want to say something that's wrong, so I'm not sure.
It sounds like Ahilleas just got a bunch of homework.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Bruce.
All right, people. Thanks so much for joining us. This was wonderful. And I think I have to add that if this sounded interesting to you guys, we have a course coming up on our platform, Hegel and the Mechanistic Worldview, which is going to be looking at the chapter of mechanism from
Okay.
Hegel's Science of Logic, right? So won't be dealing with so much philosophy of nature, but it will have sort of the foundational underpinnings of what's the philosophy of nature.
Yeah.
Ahilleas, if you want to say a few words, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it'll be quite different to sort of the nature of this talk, which was quite broad philosophy and science. It'll be much more focused on the mechanism section, the science of logic, but there are lots of interesting insights into how Hegel treats certain concepts in mechanism with the science of his day. So there will be sort of regular comparisons into science and scientific thought and how Hegel's conceptual analysis interacts with those.
Mm.
So, we'll be talking about what Hegel thinks about reductionism as a general philosophical principle. We'll be looking at Newton's law of inertia, Bruce, the
Yeah.
law of the conservation of momentum, put
Yeah.
otherwise,
Yeah.
the third law of motion, and other things as well. So,
Mm.
sort of broadly the same theme, but with a focus on mechanism in the
Yeah.
logic.
Will this be announced on Facebook? Because I don't know where
It's
what
on
your organization,
sPhil.
if you have one.
Yeah.
On
We'll
Yeah,
we'll
absolutely.
post up on Facebook as well. Yeah. So if you
Yeah.
follow us on our page there, you should get the information.
Yeah, I don't know where I saw this original announcement, but it was somewhere on Facebook. So I guess there's a lead to whatever your group is called, which I don't know what it's called.
sPhil.
Pardon me?
Why don't let's just plug in the website into the chat. 1 second.
I can
Okay.
get the
He got a
website.
YouTube channel called sPhil. It'll be there.
Blah,
Find the
blah, blah.
page there. That's the
There you go.
Facebook page.
Oh, sPhil study. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the
All right.
website for you to have a look. You can check out the course contents on that.
Let me just copy that down because I'm not sure
And
how to save the chat on this little device.
and if
When is
anyone's
registration
interested,
open? When is registration open?
Tomorrow.
tomorrow.
Okay, I'm gonna register on the 21st, though.
That's good. Happy to hear it, Bruce.
I'll be there.
Okay.
Great to have you on board.
register on the 21st. So.
I've put in the chat the Hegel and Newtonianism book. If anyone wants to have a look at it,
Right.
it's they did a reprint in 2012. That's much more affordable. Still
Yeah.
very expensive, about
I have
200
the,
quid.
I have
I
the
think-
e-text already.
I think you can find it online for free though.
Well, there are ways of getting these things if they've been digitized.
Right? Yeah. I'm sure there are ways, Ralph.
You can buy the e-text on I bought the e-text years ago on what's it called?
Right.
And I think at
Amazon.
this point we must stop the recording, otherwise
Yeah.
certain
Before we all
actors are going to
incriminate
take
ourselves.
actions against us.